to my left, we have Julian. We are about to start the Monday morning class, and this is going to be a class titled Why Fetishists Are Realists and Why That's Not Necessarily a Good Thing. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to our learning community. A year and a half ago, I started hosting these classes for free, open access on the internet, together with Julian. Jeneline occasionally teaches a class as well, but mostly Jeneline keeps me company and provides the voice of common sense, a much needed addition to the very abstract theorizing that takes place in this hour. If you are joining us for the very first time today, I just want to say again, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. We have students from around the world, and it always makes us very happy if you put in the comments the country that you are joining from. I'm always amazed just how international it is. So please do put in the comments what country you're joining us from. You can be joining at any skill level. Doesn't matter if you have any knowledge or experience of philosophy, you are more than welcome to join us here. The classes are open access. They are free for everybody to join. However, the way that we keep them free is by means of the very generous support of our patrons. So a big thank you to our patrons who are currently keeping these classes open access and free for everybody else, and are also receiving bonus content for every class. If you'd like to become a patron, please go to the link in the About page on Instagram or on YouTube, or you can also go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I'm just going to adjust the camera a little bit here. Is that better? See if it works.
Yeah.
We're very low tech here. Thank you guys for posting some of the countries that you're listening from. I saw Iraq. I saw Turkey. I saw the People's Republic of Florida come through. So that's wonderful. That's excellent. Okay, so I'm gonna launch right in. This is gonna be a class that you can enjoy standalone. You don't have to have watched the previous classes. However, I want you to know that it does form part of a series that I'm currently teaching called The Hermeneutic Temptation. This is a series on the idea of meaning and how meaning is generated and how we can think about that. I also want you to know that I'm working on a book version of these lectures that will be accessible to our patrons. So if you're interested in that, again, please take a look at the Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. And another student joining us from Thailand, Colombia. That's wonderful. That makes me really genuinely happy. So please keep those coming. It's very, very nice to know where you guys are joining us from. We are here, of course, in Spokane, Washington, which is not nearly as exotic as the countries you are joining us from. But okay, shall we begin?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's.
I have this hypothesis that I want to test. It's not a very serious hypothesis, but I want to test it on you, which is that I think that we can basically divide the world today into two types of people. On the one hand, we have people, let's call them liberals, who are willing to make small sacrifices to their daily lifestyle. For example, no longer using plastic bags at the grocery store, as long as they're reassured that nothing will fundamentally have to change. This is the one type of person, a person who makes small changes to their lifestyle because they believe that nothing has to change. And then we have the other type of person, which let's call it more conservative reactionary person, who wants to change absolutely nothing and is perfectly comfortable with the idea that the world is going to burn and we're all going to go to hell, etc. And so we have here two distinctly, let's call it, fetishistic ways of dealing with reality. On the one hand, the illusion that if I make small changes to my life, everything will be able to stay the same, which is, even though it's liberal, essentially a conservative gesture. And vice versa, the quote-unquote conservative, reactionary gesture, which is to say, I will not make any changes to my lifestyle, and in a sense, I expect that when the world goes to hell, I will somehow be spared that fate.
Well, I think you've put your finger on a really important kind of paradox for some liberals, which is the sentiment that there are important personal changes that you can make in your own life in terms of contributing to society in a better way. Like, don't use plastic bags, or don't be racist, or, try to do individual things, and that will promote societal change. And of course, the obvious response to that from both the left and the right is to say, it's either from the left to say it's not about individual behavior, it's about systematic problems, but also to say that that masks the need for bigger change. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yes and no. There's a much bigger
Okay.
point that we're trying to get at, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we have an hour here, but yes, you're absolutely right. It's good to point out that, of course, small changes, small individual lifestyle changes, don't really matter necessarily. They are performative, which isn't to say that they're bad. One of the things we're going to find out in this class, in fact, in this series, is that many of our day-to-day activities are, in a sense, performative. It's very hard to see an activity in its most direct sense. But yes, you could say, instead of focusing on individual action, we could focus on the companies that pollute are the major contributors. It's important to note here, for example, how China, when it first enacted its, I don't know what the laws are called, but the laws to restrict procreation, so the one-child family rule. The way in which China introduced that law on the international stage was specifically to say that this was an environmental approach, and that China was the most responsible actor on the world stage because China was taking the necessary decision of limiting overpopulation to protect the planet. Of course, since then we think very differently about overpopulation. We don't think that overpopulation is the cause.
Right.
But it's interesting to see how very quickly the law was justified along those very terms.
So maybe you want to talk about what do you mean by fetish here? And is there
Yeah, sure. We can talk about fetish. Yeah, that's going to be the whole class. We're going to talk for the next hour about the commodity fetish and what that means. I want to start with something very simple but quite interesting about the commodity fetish, which is this. If you read Marx's famous passage in Das Kapital on the commodity fetish, Marx does something which is essentially the opposite of what Sherlock Holmes does. If you take Marx and Sherlock Holmes, we have two entirely different hermeneutic structures. And this is also why when we call the Marxist hermeneutic a hermeneutic of suspicion, we're actually doing something that totally doesn't fit Marx. It's quite common to put the Marxist and the post-Marxist operation and method under the lens of the what is it called? The hermeneutics of suspicion. In other words, looking for the secret motivations behind things. But that's not at all what Marx is doing with the commodity fetish. So what is it, first of all, that Sherlock Holmes does? Sherlock Holmes, in most cases, looks at the world around him and finds situations that seem to be inexplicable, that appear to be almost mystical. It's like there's no human explanation possible. Famously, he goes to the very limit on this in The Hounds of the Baskervilles, where even Sherlock Holmes begins to doubt whether or not there is some kind of, supernatural element involved. And what Sherlock Holmes always does successfully is that he looks at what appears to be mystical or magical, and he yet finds the objective reality in it. He finds a way of explaining it. It can be grounded in reality, and that is, in a sense, the power of Sherlock Holmes. Now, Marx does the exact opposite. If you go to the passage on the commodity fetish, he literally starts by doing the reverse move of Sherlock Holmes. He says, what appears to you as objective reality, what appears to you as something entirely non-magical, non-mystical, actually reveals itself to be entirely magical and mystical. And so it's the opposite of the Enlightenment move. The Enlightenment move is always to say, here's something that is infused with superstition and, non-rational, irrational sentiment. And we have to drain that thing of irrationality to show the objective reality of it. For example, if you're into tabletop gaming, as I used to be when I was a teenager, in Warhammer 40K, which is one of the science fiction parts of it, the idea is that the Space Marines go out into the galaxy and they colonize the galaxy by means of secularizing it, by basically pointing out superstition. However, what they realize on the alien planets is that dark, evil gods and spirits do exist, in a sense. And this is also what Marx is saying. Marx is saying, he's not colonizing distant galaxies, but Marx essentially says what appears to you as an object, as objective reality, is in fact much more imbued with magic than you would realize. Not because Marx is in any way an occultist, but what he's talking about is the way in which we treat objects. He says we don't treat objects in their material reality. We treat objects famously as if they were people. In other words, the way in which we structure value is according to social relations. This is the commodity fetish. Now, what's really important to understand here, to go back to what you asked, which is what is fetish, is that the fetish is essentially the opposite of symptom. Now, here we're already combining Marx and Freud again, which is something that if you've watched more of these classes, you're aware of that I do this frequently. The idea of the fetish essentially makes it appear like everything is fine, like everything is as it appears. This is also why Marx says the commodity fetish makes objects appear as if they were natural, as if they were objective reality, even though they're not. The symptom is always what emerges when you reach the deadlock of that fantasy, when the truth of the thing suddenly comes out. And so, in a sense, what's funny is that if you are to live in this world today, fetishists are, in a sense, perfectly well adjusted. In order to properly survive and manage in this world, especially in this broken world that is very strongly affected by the pandemic, you have to be a fetishist. In other words, you have to look around you and you have to see all the inconsistencies and all the levels in which our society is unjust and unequal and broken. And you have to tell yourself, this is just fine. That is the... Julian and I were reading an article in the newspaper where the journalist observed that the most loaded phrase in the pandemic world, in the pandemic lexicon is, do you remember what it was? It's to say, oh, it's probably fine. The words "it's probably fine" are sort of at the heart of all of our interactions because we no longer have proper awareness of what risk is, what constitutes a risky interaction. And so to be a fetishist is to be a realist. You look at the world around you and you say, here is objective reality, and I have to supplement it with all this meaning in order to be able to function. What happens with the symptom is the thing that emerges, the behavior that emerges when you struggle to stitch everything together. When something happens that resists the way in which you fetishistically stitch together reality. Now, I'll give you some examples of this and we can sort of elaborate a little bit more. Unless you have any
it's good.
Any questions there?
No, it's really helpful to think about that as the opposite of symptom.
Yeah, I mean it's not literally the opposite, but I think that it's a helpful.
It's a helpful contrast, yeah.
So there's a couple of things to say about this here. One of them is, so if Marx is performing this thing, right, which is to essentially say, I'm going to do the opposite of the Enlightenment practice, which is that I'm going to, in a sense, look at objects that appear to be objective, and I'm going to show the way in which they are actually informed with, magical powers. Marx has another famous expression in his essay, or not essay, but the section within Capital on the commodity fetish, where he says nobody knows how it works, and yet we continue to go on as if we did know how it works. Mm-hmm. And one of the contributions that, for example, Zizek has made is to sort of invert that, to say, in today's world, everybody knows that it can't go on. Everybody knows, in a sense, how it works, mm-hmm. and yet we continue anyway. Mm-hmm. And so here we go from fetishism, which is trying to stitch it together, to say, I believe that this is objective reality, towards fetishistic disavowal. And fetishistic disavowal is no longer to say, I don't know how it works, I continue to do it, but to say, I know exactly how it works, and yet I continue to do it. And so here we're entering into a discussion on belief and our relationship to what constitutes something. I'll give you an example. There's this very funny thing that Marx writes about, which is, in a sense, is an inversion of the Hegelian idea of reflexive determination. So Marx inverts the Hegelian idea of reflexive determination and makes it into determinate reflection. It's a famous footnote about this. And the funny thing and it's actually very comic, like it's a very technical term, but you'll find it to be surprisingly comic. And it works like this. Imagine that you take a class about the commodity fetish, right? As you are, of course, right now, taking a class on the commodity fetish. Imagine that you're taking a class on the commodity fetish. and you learn from Marx that what appear to be objective things, Marx famously talks about a table, aren't just objective things existing in the world, but are imbued with value, which is based on social relations. In other words, we treat objects as people. Objects become magical. We have a fetishistic attachment to objects. You learn all of this, and then a week later, you go back to your professor and you say, I want my money back. And he says, why do you want your money back? And he says, well, I've learned that, objects don't really exist as they are, but the objects don't seem to know that. Other people continue to treat the objects as if they had this kind of value. And so it doesn't matter that I feel this way. For example, let's say that you buy, it's easy to know that a Nike t-shirt with a logo of Nike on it, or whatever, Balenciaga or something, shouldn't be more valuable than a regular t-shirt. In fact, you could say, why is a cotton t-shirt, which is of a discernibly better quality, cheaper than the synthetic t-shirt that has the logo on it? Just because you realize that this is, in a sense, a commodity fetish, doesn't mean that it suddenly stops being a commodity fetish.
You've upended the system.
Yeah, you haven't. You've seen through it, but then you realize everybody's seen through it. Everybody's seen through it, and yet they continue to participate as if it were true. And so why does this relate to Hegel's idea of reflexive determination and Marx's inversion of it as determinate reflection? Hegel's idea, and I'm not going to go too deep into Hegel, Hegel's idea of reflexive determination is that identity and difference all stem from a sort of fundamental void or empty space. And it's within that void that we have differentiation that takes place. I've done classes on this. I'm not going to go too deep into this. Marx has a quite interesting take on this, which is to say that it's actually the other way around. We don't begin with a nothing upon which we have identity and differentiation. It's that the nothingness is embedded within differentiation and identity itself. In other words, you don't go from nothing to something. There's a nothing that is already embedded within the thing itself. In other words, this is what I said last week. Marx is not interested in the true value of the commodity. Marx is not telling you, oh, we need to dispel the magical part of the commodity in order to find its true nature. Because, see, if he did that, he would actually be doing the Enlightenment thing again, which is to say, oh, here's the magically imbued object, and we have to go away from this towards the objective reality of the object. Marx says that what appears as the objective reality of the object is precisely mediated by this abstraction. This is also why it's so important that for Marx, money is precisely the emergence of a concrete entity that stitches together the abstraction of value. We look at money and we usually think to ourselves that money is abstract. Money is just a piece of paper. But for Marx, and this is where Marx remains very Hegelian. Remember, at the very beginning of this series, I showed you how for Hegel, concrete and abstract is always reversed. For Hegel, what is concrete is abstract, and what is abstract is concrete. The same is true for Marx. If value is abstract, then it requires a concrete, if you will, in a Lacanian sense, point de capiton, master signifier, to close it, to make it, in a sense, concrete. However, where Marx is so clever is Marx says that what appears as abstract, i.e. value, is of course very concrete. Anybody who has lived on the receiving end of poverty knows that, yes, wealth is abstract and money is abstract, and yet, but that's precisely why it hurts. So if value is concrete, money is abstract. However, the way in which Marx reverts the determinate reflection is to say that the only way that value can remain abstract is by the emergence of the token of money, which is precisely abstraction rendered concrete. And what that does, two sides of the same coin, no pun intended, is that it reverts value back into concrete abstraction. Is this too theoretical?
No,
I don't know. This is
no.
We're going fast here, but it's I'm going to keep it all in perspective. Okay, to make it a little bit more simple. Okay, this is also, by the way, this is a riff. This is also why Marx always emphasizes that value is value in motion. Because it can't stand still. It has to be continuously refracted as the determinated in that sense. Okay, so here's another example of this that will hopefully make it a little bit easier to grasp that process, which is admittedly a little bit difficult to grasp. And the classic image for Hegel of determinate reflection is the king, the idea of the king, and how a king has his kingliness. Now, the sort of obvious thing, the obvious quote unquote critical hermeneutic would be to say, essentially what Lacan says, that the king who thinks he is a king is a fool. That the king has no essence of being king, that we make you king. This is one of those sort of classic, like, I don't know, movie moments, right? Which is like the majority realizes that they've imbued the figurehead with the power. Like it's, I mean, whatever. It's the idea that the king has no authority other than that the system imbues him with authority. That's not a very interesting thing to say. This is something that ultimately Marx and Hegel and even Freud are not interested in. It's a good starting point. To go back to last week, we're here at the level of the content and the form. To say, you know, there is no such thing as king. King is a social construct, etc. That's fine, but it doesn't really matter, because here's the thing. Everybody knows that already. If you say, hey, did you know that the king isn't actually king? He's only king because we believe he's king. It doesn't matter. He's not going to suddenly not become king. There's not
It
that.
doesn't undermine the system.
No, exactly. This is again, go back to Marx. It's not that we don't know how it works and thus we participate. We know how it works and thus we participate. And so to simply point out that the king is king because we pretend he's king doesn't have any revolutionary content in and of itself. In a sense, everybody knows that already. And so the question then is, if we learn about the commodity fetish in the same way that we learn about the fact that the king, that we have a fetishistic relationship to the king, how do we actually go through that? How do we actually get to a point where we can have some form of resistance to it? And here we have an interesting leap that we can make to the idea of anxiety and how anxiety relates to the fetish and to the symptom. Now, Freud has this interesting idea, which is that fear is actually preferable to anxiety, because anxiety is indeterminate. Anxiety is, in a sense, when you're in a state of suspension. The most beautiful rendering of what it means to be anxious is actually in the film The Death of Stalin, where, I don't know, who comes home? Khrushchev or something?
I think so, yeah.
Comes home after meeting with Stalin, having drinks, beers, and he comes home, and his wife is sitting at the table, and she's very serious. And they both sit down at the table, sort of classic couple doing midnight calculations of, their finances. Except instead of doing their finances, they're writing down a list of what are the things that Stalin laughed at, and what are the things that Stalin didn't laugh at. Mm-hmm. And because he wants to constantly know what is in Stalin's mind acceptable and not acceptable, because anybody could be executed at a whim, essentially. And so they have to create this taxonomy of what Stalin thought was funny. And that is exactly anxiety. That is not fear. Fear is, I'm afraid of you because you will force me to do something, or I'm afraid of you because you're a monster, or whatever. Anxiety is the I don't know what you think is good and what you think is bad. Anxiety is ambiguity, makes us distinctly uncomfortable. Most of us would much rather live in fear than live in anxiety. This is also why, for example, Freud, and this is a counterintuitive thing for Freud to say, but hopefully it'll make sense in this context, Freud says that fear can actually be comforting. Now, anybody who's been afraid will probably dispute this. However, the counterpoint to that is that we routinely go and watch very scary movies because we enjoy simulating fear. Fear is a very easy emotion compared to anxiety. In fact, anxiety is not technically an emotion, it's an affect. Anxiety is symptomatic. Anxiety emerges as a symptom because it's trying to point out to you that which cannot be properly formalized, that which exists, which resists formalization. Fear, on the other hand, is a direct determination, which is, here's something scary, you are afraid of it. As long as you are fearful, you are on the level of, let's say, the psychotic, for whom everything fits. It's only on the level of anxiety that you start having hysteria, which is to question whether or not you should be anxious. One of the definitions of being anxious is that you're not sure whether or not you should be anxious. If you knew that you should be anxious, that would become fear. Anxiety only exists in this indeterminate way.
I feel like I experienced that if I saw I am not a big fan of scary movies, but we went to see A Quiet Place Part 2. And I really had that sense of like, at the beginning, I'm anxious because I don't know what to be afraid about.
Right.
And then once I have a sense of sort of the lay of the land, then I'm no longer anxious. I just get to experience the fear. And it's something very specific and much more enjoyable.
It's super enjoyable. So
Much more enjoyable is definitely a problematic way to say it. But yeah, I get what you mean.
what all horror movies do, at least the ones that are satisfying, are that they resolve your anxiety. So they create a situation in which you think that something is going to happen, like you're walking through a dark room, and then there's like suddenly something very scary that happens. And your anxiety is resolved because you have, in a sense, received the fear. Now, a really scary movie would be a movie that constantly promises a jump scare, but nothing scary ever happens. And of course, at that point, we're back at the level of like the David Lynch uncanny. Part of what makes David Lynch anxiety-inducing to watch, like Twin Peaks, is that you will go through entire episodes expecting there to be a release of fear, and it never happens. Which is also why, again, fear is in a sense therapeutic, because fear is the resolution of, it's good that I was anxious because there was a payoff here, essentially. There's a perfect moment in the old Grudge movie, the Japanese version of The Grudge, an opening scene where the woman is walking up a stairs and the camera drifts towards the window, and we see the face of the ghost-like child peering through the window. Very spooky. And the woman doesn't see it. So we have the classic, you missed the thing kind of feeling. It's like, we're all children yelling at the screen that the hero should pay attention. And then she climbs into bed, and we're still uncertain what's going to happen. And then she's about to go to sleep, and there's this quite lengthy sequence of her going to bed, all of which is highly anxiety-inducing, since we now know that there is a ghost. And then she turns off the light, pulls up the covers, and of course the dead child is already under the covers with her. And so we have this satisfying release of all that tension. It's quite wonderful and very scary. Anyway, I don't want to do a whole riff on The Ring, but it's also why The Ring is ultimately more spooky than The Grudge, because The Ring introduced the idea that, and this is like for Gen Z, you will never understand this particular fear, but televisions used to produce static, and The Ring suggested that the static in your television was like a ghostly emanation. Precisely because there's no way of verifying it. So if your TV went static, you almost wish that a ghost would show up, because then
just
at least
to resolve the anxiety.
to resolve the anxiety, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
The Ring is what ruined horror films.
So here's the thing.
Thank you.
So technically, Freud refers to anxiety as a fear of separation or a fear of loss. So he says that anxiety is the fear of loss from, I don't know, your mother, your parent. You're anxious at the idea of losing them. We're sort of back with like the more simple Freud, essentially here. And what Lacan does, which is quite nice, is he, again, as he always does, is he radicalizes Freud. Lacan says that yes, anxiety is about fear of loss. However, anxiety is, in its most concrete form, about over proximity, not about being removed from it. And what Lacan says is that over proximity to the thing that you fear, the thing that you're anxious about, leads you to a fear of a loss, but it's not the fear of a loss of any object. It's the fear of a loss of reality itself. So let me give you an example of that. Let's go back to the example of the horror movie. You're walking down a corridor at night. Freud would say anxiety is that you're afraid you're going to lose, I don't know, your parent, your mother, the thing that protects you. Lacan says that your anxiety is actually about over proximity. You know that you're getting closer to the monster. And the fact that you know there's going to be a jump scare is what makes it scary. If the jump scare came out of nowhere, like imagine you're watching a movie that's like a romantic comedy, and all of a sudden a jump scare emerged out of nowhere, no context, in your face, it would probably A, not be scary, it would be absurd, and secondly, it would be very annoying. The only way that the jump scare works is because you know it's coming. It's about over proximity to the thing that you're trying to exclude. And so what Lacan does in a weird way is that he actually brings back a Hegelian and Marxist element into the Freudian edifice, which is what Lacan does quite frequently, which is to say that your anxiety is not that you don't know the thing. Your anxiety is precisely that you know the thing and yet you continue anyway. So we're back at the opposite of what Marx calls the commodity fetish, is you know what's coming and yet you participate as if it weren't coming. And that's exactly how the jump scare works. Everybody knows the jump scare is coming, and the movie plays with your expectations as to when it comes. And so it's satisfying at the moment that the tension is released. This is also, for example, when, okay, let's bring this back to the idea of the fetish here. Now, there's a certain type of existential anxiety or existential dread that we experience when we contemplate objective reality. If you're anything like me, if you go to a planetarium is like a haunted house. A haunted house is very comforting for me because I know that everybody is just dressed up and they're there to frighten me. In fact, I have paid them to induce chills, as it were. When I go to a planetarium, I realize that A, nobody is dressed up out in the universe, and B, they're not there to make me frightened. The universe simply doesn't care whether or not I exist. I find the planetarium much more frightening because it presents me with the idea that I'm a finite human being who's created an infinite, not infinite, but who's created a narrative, a web of meaning about my existence on this earth that is ultimately fundamentally inconsequential to the larger order of being and the infinite expansion of time itself in the galaxy. It's like a perfect recipe for existential dread or a panic attack, which isn't to diminish people's panic attacks, because I don't experience panic attacks. At least thus far, I have not had a panic attack. And so what happens, of course, in that situation is I'm not scared at the planetarium because I'm contemplating something that doesn't exist. I'm scared, or I'm anxious, I should say. I'm anxious because I'm contemplating the full scope of objective reality. And so the best way for me to stop feeling anxious about the objective reality of the universe is to imbue it with fetishistic practices. Science fiction. I can start thinking about, well, maybe one day we'll live on Mars. I can start thinking about how beautiful said planet is. I can create stories in my mind. I create a narrative framework for how I contemplate the existence of the universe and my relationship to it. This can even take place on the level of wonder itself. As soon as a scientist tells you to look up into the sky, or that we should encourage children to look up into the sky because it tells them something about the boundless energy of human endeavor and like how there's nothing we can't do because we went to the moon, etc., we're totally back at the level of the fetish. This is exactly the level of the fetish. You're trying to make sense of something which defies meaning, in a sense, and its scope, by bringing it back into something that can make sense to you on that level. And so what appears as our contemplation of objective reality, science, space, going to the moon, for Marx, again, would be precisely very much a fetishistic practice, because to engage with objective reality in its most pure form is fundamentally impossible for us. It's extremely anxiety-inducing. And so what Lacan would essentially argue here is that we have to, in a sense, stitch our hysteric relationship to objective reality. In other words, objective reality makes us hysterical because we have to ask, where does it fit within the overall sequence of purpose and meaning? And so the way in which we do that is through fetishistic relationship, which is also to say that anxiety is working on the level of fetish. Anxiety is the awareness of the indeterminate nature. Where does it fit within my experience of objective reality? And the process of making it fit is precisely how that anxiety is subdued. Now, I'll give you an example of this because I realize we're doing a lot here. This is an anecdote from a family anecdote, which is this. A relative of mine has a young child. And one of the things that you do when you're a parent, at least something that my relative has done, is that every once in a while she will explain something by means of saying, because God wanted it so. Because children become hysterical. Children ask many questions, right? Not hysterical as in screaming, but hysterical as in questioning the order of things. And so be growing up in a not a fundamental religious sense, but sort of a moderately religious sense, my relative would say, well, the child would say, why does a tree exist? And she would say, well, because God wanted there to be a tree. However, what's beautiful about having children is that you immediately run into all these sort of, I don't know, psychoanalytic dead ends,
Yeah.
which is her child did something totally understandable, which is that if God said that this tree should exist, she starts looking around her and thinking, well, what are the things that God thought shouldn't exist? And so now whenever she encounters something new, she will go to her mother and say, did God want this to exist? And so suddenly we've gone from my relatives attempt to stitch together. Again, remember Lacan said that God will persist as long as the word because ... exists, right? God is a way of saying because. Why does this exist? Well, because. So as long as she continues to tell her child, this exists because God wanted it so, the child will then create a taxonomy according to which everything is either wanted by God or not wanted by God, which is, of course, the emergence of a certain type of fundamentalism, which can be very, very dangerous here. But I thought that was I really thought that was kind of an interesting anecdote, because this is exactly the problem, is that if we are, I want to take it a step back here. If we go back to the idea of the king, right? And we say that it doesn't matter to simply point out the fact that the king is a king because it's a construct. Mm-hmm. What is it that we have to do in order to go beyond it? The Marxist Freudian overlap would always be to say that symptom and fetish are not simply opposite. It's not either you buy into the fetish or you have the symptom. It's that buying into the fetish will eventually inherently lead to symptomatic expression. In other words, because the fetish is in a sense not real, it will always, in one way or another, be exposed. It will find its internal limit. This is exactly what happened in the case of my relative and her daughter, which is she created a fetishistic participation, which is a form of disavowal, which is to say, well, the tree exists because God willed it. And once you apply that systematically, the symptomatic part of it comes out. The symptom, which is the part at which it breaks down, the symptom being, of course, well, what is it that God didn't want? Mm-hmm. And so you find that one thing that resists the system. Now, what's important to note here is that the symptomatic expression was never there to begin with. In other words, if you start looking around you and you say, what are the things that God willed and the things that God didn't will? If you arrive at something that somehow you've convinced yourself of God didn't will, that wasn't that way to begin with. The disavowal, the thing that God didn't will, emerges only because of the fetishistic disavowal taking place. It's not like it was like that to begin with. I feel like this is still a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try to see if there's a way that we can sort of wrap that up. Okay, I'll give you an example. You probably know the expression, fake it till you make it. But here's something interesting about fake it till you make it, is that who exactly are you trying to convince? You could say, oh no, we lost the Instagram live stream. Oh, that sucks.
Oh, no.
All right, we're gonna have to go back to Instagram.
Your only hope, YouTube.
Let's see, we're gonna go back. Yeah, it actually hasn't happened in a while. Okay, checking connection. Okay, hello everybody. We are back on Instagram Live. We lost the beginning of the class. However, you can find the full class on YouTube, or you can download it through our Patreon. I'm going to pick up where we left off, which is the expression "fake it till you make it." And one of the interesting things about "fake it till you make it" is this: if you are faking it, who are you faking it for? Are you faking it for other people? Or are you faking it for yourself? In other words, is it that you are performing as if you were the thing so that other people believe it, so that you believe it? Or are you performing it to yourself so that you will be able to convincingly make other people believe that you are? Mm-hmm. This is where we go back to Marx's idea of determinate reflection, which is determinate reflection, which is precisely that it is indeterminate. It's not that you are such a good faker that people actually believe you are the thing. Nor is it that once people believe you are the thing, you actually believe it yourself. Anybody who's experienced fraud syndrome will know exactly how that works. Instead, what happens is that on the level of identification, all identification is mediated in that sense. Because there is no level at which you are authentically interacting with the world. Fake it till you make it isn't something that you move into. Fake it till you make it is something you've always already done. This is also, for example, when people say, I'm going to pray for you, it's a very disingenuous thing to say. All praying is praying for you. In a very like Pascalian way, the idea of prayer is to do it as if it worked. Because it's not that you're saying, I'm going to start praying now because I'm going to speak directly to God. We talked about this at length in the previous class with the idea of like glossolalia. Someone who prays isn't praying because they anticipate speaking directly to God. In fact, if you started praying and you heard a voice in your head that said, Julian, shut up, I don't have time now, you'd be distinctly alarmed.
I'm busy planting trees.
Exactly. The whole point of prayer in that sense is because it's not expected to be received directly as such. We have to create we have to create some kind of if you want to use the word fetishistic idea of what it means. Well, I'm doing it for me, or a prayer is like writing something down, it gets it off your chest, or I'm sending a prayer into the void because perhaps God will hear it, or I'm praying because if everybody prays simultaneously, we become the human community on earth. Like there's many different ways in which we stitch the gap of prayer. And the one thing that would dissolve it would be precisely if God were listening. In fact, if you knew God were listening, you would be much less likely to pray, probably. There's a beautiful example of this in the Watchmen televised series that came out on HBO last year. So if you're familiar with the Watchmen, there's a character known as Dr. Manhattan. And Dr. Manhattan is an omnipotent being, essentially. He's like a godlike figure that exists outside of time. He can go through multiple dimensions. And this is a sort of a pretty blunt storyline about the death of God, etc., is Dr. Manhattan leaves the world. He leaves us behind. God is dead. God has abandoned us. And so one of the things that has happened is that even though Dr. Manhattan is gone, the presence of Dr. Manhattan remains in the public consciousness. And so people put up what are essentially telephone booths. They're like therapeutic telephone booths where you can commune with Dr. Manhattan. Because now Dr. Manhattan exists in space, right? He's gone to another dimension, another galaxy. And so we simply say, when you look to the sky, you're looking towards some place where Dr. Manhattan could be. I hope you start seeing the linkages with what we did earlier in the class. And so if you go into said booth, you grab a telephone and you start speaking as if you were speaking to Dr. Manhattan. It's like a confessional almost. And then you pay a little bit of money and that message is broadcast out into space. So it gives you the satisfaction of having released that, as it were. And the funny thing is that one of the characters, the former lover of Dr. Manhattan, she routinely goes into this booth. Of course, she knows that he's never going to listen. Even if Dr. Manhattan were interested in Earth, the last thing he would do would be listen to digitized messages broadcast by random people in a public confessional. And yet she goes, knowing that it doesn't work, because it's a relief for her to speak to him as if they were still together. And of course, what sets off part of the drama of the series is precisely that he does listen at a certain point. He does receive her message, which is not intended by her at all. In fact, she doesn't want him to receive that message. And this is, in a sense, what I was saying about prayer, is that the whole point about prayer isn't to say, I am sending a message to God. I mean, first of all, what would I say? Who would you be? Instead, you are praying for other people. You're praying for the idea of prayer itself, which is why when someone says to you, I am praying for you, they're actually doing the opposite. They're praying for you as a non-Christian, which is also almost a sense of like, I'm doing you a favor, as it were. It's a very it's a very unpleasant thing to be prayed for in that sense. This is also why Donald Trump was the president who presumably was prayed for the most of all presidents, something which is one of the few things he didn't brag about, by the way, because Donald Trump understood very well that being prayed for is not a sign of wishing that person necessarily goodwill. It's like, I wish that God would stay your hand, as
That's
it were.
also like, isn't there a scene in The West Wing when the press secretary is approached and they say, "You're one of the figures that we're going to be praying for,"
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then she thinks that it's so nice, and then she realizes that it's like, we think that you're sinful and need redemption. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's very funny. The thing that Donald Trump did brag about was that he said that he had like the most Bibles of any president, which is kind of funny because first of all, like Bibles, it tends to be sort of a quality over quantity kind of thing. You know, it's not just that like you have many Bibles. That doesn't really say anything about you. It's not like, you know, you don't unless you're a collector. But so many people, so many Christians and evangelicals would send Donald Trump Bibles hoping that he would read them, that apparently, supposedly, I don't know if this is true, in the Mar-a-Lago residence that he keeps, there is a Bible room where they collect all of the Bibles, or not all, but presumably many of the Bibles that are sent to him routinely, which is a pretty, I have to say, that is kind of a badass thing. Like, if I were like the leader of
That's what the Trump library will be.
yeah, the Trump library will just be Bibles that people sent
unread
to him.
Bibles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which made it so perfect, of course, when Trump appeared in the photo thing in front of the church with the Bible upside down, etc. Anyway, we can do a whole form content thing, but we're not going to do that because it's too simple here. So I want to end here because we're reaching the end of this class. And apologies for those of you who dropped out of the Instagram, or Instagram dropped out on you. This is also why we also record it on YouTube and on Patreon to have a backup. I started the class by saying that fetishists are realists and why that may not be as good of a thing as we think. Now, in order to be a quote-unquote realist in the world, you have to fill the gap all the time. The very idea of realism as part of the Enlightenment practice is distinctly mystical, you're constantly having to create narratives to suggest that it is realistic. It's also the point that Adorno and Horkheimer make in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment idea and the Enlightenment ideal is distinctly ideological in its functioning. And on a very, let's say on a very simple level, if the Enlightenment project is to take that which appears to be mystical and to show the objective reality in it, the standard operation of Marx and also of Freud is always to point out that what you consider to be objective reality already contains fetishistic disavowal in order to keep it complete, in order to keep it objective. And it's about rehystericizing the psychotic subject in psychoanalytic terms, or reintroducing differentiation within what appears to be whole. This is also why class struggle is not about the relationship between classes. It's only the realist, the bourgeois realist, who would see class struggle as one class fighting the other class. Class struggle is precisely the emergence of internal differentiation between what is projected as being one society and one equal society in which everybody follows the profit motive, etc. Class struggle is the name of the reemergence of a symptomatic difference that was fetishistically disavowed within the bourgeoisie. That is precisely to do, again, the standard anti-Sherlock Holmes operation, which is to point out what appears to be whole, objective reality, society, is actually precipitated by the obfuscation of internal differentiation. And so class struggle is not about how do classes relate, which the bourgeoisie is totally interested in. Like, middle class people love talking about the way in which there are certain class demarcations,
Nouveau riche, realistic
dialects,
yeah.
what kind of clothes you wear, what kind of, like, this is exactly like the class struggle as the middle class envisions it, which is I'm trying to move up the scale of ladder, the ladder of class. Whereas the Marxist hermeneutic is precisely always to say that class struggle is the awareness that what appears to be a complete system of relations is totally, fundamentally, in a sense, differentiated. If that makes, does that make sense? I think so. And so when we say that the fetishist is the realist, is the fetishist is the person who thinks that everything fits. And in a sense, we are all fetishists. We require fetish in order to function, especially in a continually fractured world. A world that is screaming to us all of the things that cannot go on as they are going on. And the more that happens, the more we end up doing the opposite. We're no longer just participating knowing that it cannot be sustained. We're no longer participating not knowing that it cannot be sustained. We're participating knowingly that it cannot be sustained. And so what happens is sort of an acceleration, in a sense, of that participation. As the world heats up, we're likely to install more air conditioning units. As more people get sick, we're likely to further politicize public health. And so we accelerate that. And this is also why, ultimately, the symptom doesn't emerge as the inverse of the fetish. The symptom emerges as the fetishistic disavowal itself. In other words, the more we engage in the practice of pretending like everything is complete, the more the internal limit of it will appear. And this is ultimately a form of recognition that, as long as we disavow it, creates a form of anxiety. The anxiety of pretending like everything can continue as it is, knowing that it cannot continue as it is, which is also why anxiety is perhaps the determining affect or the most prevalent feature of the modern age. It's precisely a sense of things not fitting and not being able to continue. And one of the ways in which that anxiety is stemmed is through reactionary politics, to promise you a return to a certain imaginary past where everything was good. And so to go back to the beginning of the class, when I said that there's essentially two types of people. There's people, let's call them liberals, who say that as long as we make minor changes to our world, everything will continue as it is. It's fetishistic because there never was the idea of something that could be fixed with minor changes. This is also like the whole idea that capitalism works as long as we iron out the creases of capitalism. No, the creases are inherent to capitalism. And so to make little changes is precisely what keeps the system going as it is. And those reactionaries who say, well, I'm not going to make any changes to my lifestyle, I'm going to let everything burn, those are the people who, if you really ask them, don't think that they're the ones who have to pay the price. Usually they think the people who have to pay the price are people of color or poor people or people who live in another country. And so in both cases, we have fetishistic disavowal, which is essentially, even though it's two sides of the same coin, the same thing. And one of the standard operations of the Marxist Freudian hermeneutic is to point out that those two are closer than you might think, which is also why the centrist is closer to the reactionary. This is a classic like coming together. To go back finally to the idea of the king, remember we said that to simply point out that the king is a king because of a social construct, why is that not enough? Here's the thing. We're never going to get to a point where somebody is king by means of the perfect king, the right king. This is also the problem with the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is essentially conservative because the problem of the steward of Gondor is that he's not the rightful king. And as long as we find the rightful king, i.e. Aragorn, Lina Numenor, etc., everything will have an age of plenty. And the movie wraps up like this. We've installed the rightful king to supplant the not rightful king, in a sense, the secular king, and now everything will continue and everything will be wonderful.
In harmony.
But the whole point isn't to say that one king is more or less right. It's the Saint-Just quote, which is that the problem is that he's king. It's not that he's the righteous king or not righteous king. I've sometimes attributed this to Robespierre, but it is definitely Saint-Just. That is a mistake I've made before. I checked it the other day. And so the funny thing here is that you cannot do this on the level of individual action. To do it on the level of individual action means that, yes, you've realized that the commodity is a fetish, that we have a fetishistic relationship to the commodity. But nobody told the commodity. This is Lacan's joke also about existentialism. Lacan said that when the existentialists declared the death of God, they forgot to tell God. God didn't get the memo. And the same is true for an individual critique of the commodity fetish. If you take a class on commodity fetishism, you can go back to your teacher and say, well, I realize that the commodity is fetishistic, but does the commodity realize it? As long as we all continue to treat it as if it were magical, it is magical in that sense. And so the only way to actually change anything is to have that determinate reflection inversed. And now we're back at Hegel with reflexive determination. If everybody changes their stance on reality, reality itself changes. You cannot, in a sense, dispel the commodity fetish by pointing out the truth of the fetish. The truth of the fetish emerges itself symptomatically, which is the recognition of it through a collective consciousness. And what happens then is not that we imbue the real value back into the object, it's simply that the magic of the object becomes a different kind of magic. And that different kind of magic used to be called utopia. And the irony, of course, is that the only existing utopia today is the utopia of continuing to exist in this burning and degrading world, pretending like it's going to be fine. That's utopia. And it's exactly when you realize that that's a utopia that suddenly the utopia, which Marxists called utopia, starts seeming more real. In other words, the exact moment where the concrete and abstract invert, where you realize that what appears to be concrete objective reality is a total fabrication, an abstraction, and you can move in to the genuinely new world, which is the world of quote unquote revolution for Marx. And vice versa, as long as you maintain that what we're living today is the only world that can be thought, the world of objective reality, you cannot move into that. And so our relationship to the world today is utopian. The idea that things can keep going on as they are is distinctly utopian. And the only way to realize that that is not true is the idea of utopia. So hopefully all the components are coming into play here. Thank you guys so much for listening today. We're going to wrap up, but we're going to be hosting a 1-hour bonus discussion on Proust. Marcel Proust, In Search of Lost Time. I'm going to be hosting a 1-hour bonus class in 5 minutes on Discord because it's fun to do something else every once in a while. So if you'd like to join us for the special session on Proust, or if you'd like to download it, including this class, if you'd like to download this class and every class that I've ever taught, please consider becoming a patron. It starts at just $5 a month. There's a link in our bio in our About page. It's www.patreon.com/Julian and Julian. If you support our Patreon, not only do you get access to bonus features, it also helps us keep these classes free and open access for everybody else. So on behalf of everybody watching, from Turkey to, I don't know, Jordan to Mexico to Indonesia to Thailand, a big thank you to our patrons who continue to make it financially feasible for Jenlene and myself to keep these classes for free on the internet. All right, thank you guys so much. I'm going to be posting the whole class pretty soon. And until then, hope you have a wonderful beginning to your week, and we shall see you next Monday. All right. Bye, guys.
Take care.